Now, the dollar maintained most of its recent gains ahead of a key Federal Reserve policy announcement. Asian markets struggled along as investors returned from public holidays across the region. Technology stocks were mixed even after Apple released a better-than-expected earnings that soothed worries about iPhone sales. While the central bank is not expected to lift interest rates, its post-meeting statement will give clues on its plans on whether it will announce 3 or 4 more this year. On Wall Street, the S&P 500 eked out gains on Tuesday after comments from a Trump administration official on trade with China and the Mexican economy minister on the negotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement provided cause for optimism. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell 0.27%, the S&P 500 gained 0.25%, and the Nasdaq Composite Index added 0.91%. Let's take a look at your other markets now. Makwe Masilela from Makwe Fund Managers joins me now for more on the markets. Thanks so much for your time on SABC News. Let's start with the rand. We saw it hitting 4-month lows and we're seeing it battling against the dollar. What are the factors that are leading to that?
You know, the fact that we expect interest rates to go up in America, and that was indicated by the yields on the 10-year bond that managed to touch almost 3%. As we're talking now, I think that's sitting around 2.98. And the fact that we've seen inflation in the U.S., that there will be inflation, and good economic data coming of the U.S., that managed to give a boost to the U.S. dollar. And compared to the European markets, it's a different story. Check the numbers that came out today about their growth. It shows that the guys are still struggling from that side of the world. And that confirms that it will take the European Central Bank, you know, a bit longer for them to start tapering whatever they need to do. So that's kind of the opposite of the U.S. is doing. Then we've seen the euro struggling, and South Africa trading mainly with the European Union. We tend to track the euro more than anything. Okay. So that's negative for the rand. And South Africa itself, compared to its peers, you know, emerging market peers, we've got one of the huge current account deficit. So that's also not doing us justice. And anyway, South African rand itself, it's a very liquid currency. It tends to be traded more than other emerging market currencies. Mm-hmm.
How much of a role does the fact that the U.S. is not going to make South African steel imports South Africa is not exempt from U.S. tariffs. We're now going to have to pay, I think, between 10 and 15%, even though the DTI lobbied for this not to happen. How much of an impact does that have on our rand and generally on our steel industry? I
think it has an impact mainly on the steel industry itself, especially if you look at the whole supply chain of steel. Yes, South Africa, I mean, if the imports, you know, that we sent to the U.S., we account for just less than 1%, you know, of the steel industry in the U.S. But unfortunately, back home here, it counts for almost 5 to 6% of our local production. So you look at the whole supply chain of steel, that has a potential to affect anything more than 7,000 jobs. So that will have a negative impact. And given that already we've got high unemployment rate, and unfortunately back home here, any person working is responsible for at least on average 3 to 4 people. Mm-hmm. So that's not good news for our steel industry and generally for our economy.
Some good news is ABSA's PMI is out today, and it seems as though the manufacturing sector is on the way to recovery.
And interesting that, you know, new orders, that the ones which managed to help us. And new orders, I think they weigh just 1/3 of the whole index. So I think they account for 0.3 or so. So seeing new orders improving, but you look at in relation to what the Chinese numbers were this morning, they're also a good number, you know, but they were slow when it comes to their export. That says something about the global demand. We check what India's numbers were, which were also released this morning. They're also good numbers. But going forward, I think we'll have a bit of a challenge if there's anything we can take from the Chinese numbers.
Mm-hmm. We saw Sen's announcement just before the 1 p.m. news bulletin. PSG's Yanni Mouton has announced that he is suffering from a condition, dementia, that he's managing. How are the markets reacting in any way to this, and is PSG stock going to be affected? I know that sounds like quite an awful thing to ask.
Sure, but the markets so far, they've not given any reaction because the guy is not an executive. He's more on a non-executive role. And I think with or without him, the company will manage to cope. And I think it was clever of PSG not to announce that the guy will leave the board with immediate effect. But I think in the long term, the guy, unfortunately, he will have to leave the board.
And let's go back to this issue of the rand that we touched on in the beginning. When we were seeing the rand performing quite well after President Cyril Ramaphosa became our president, a lot of that was affected to him, or attributed to him rather. How much of a role does our politics and our policies play in the rand strength? Or are we seeing now that it's not about what's happening with our politics, but what's happening with the US dollar and what's happening with the euro?
It's more of a global story, and it's just so unfortunate, as much as our policies and politics are important, but unfortunately, in this instance, interest rates, if they have to go up in the US, they'll overshadow whatever that we have to do locally.
Okay, now in the US, the Fed is expected to keep rates on hold. How is this going to affect the dollar and, more importantly, the euro, because that tracks back to us?
We've seen the dollar still maintaining the strength that it started, having since last week, So far, it's still at those highs, almost 4 months high. And remember now, the dollar is strengthening against other currencies. You are Japanese yen as well, because Japan as well, just like Switzerland, the European Union, we're not expecting them to move when it comes to interest rates. So that interest rate differential will continue to benefit the US dollar.
Makwe Masilela from Makwe Fund Managers, thanks so much for your time on SABC News. It's time for short